Good evening. It is a great pleasure to have you here for what I think will be a most interesting and provocative forum. Oh, no. For the evening. Eagerly anticipated, and we thank our participants, and we look forward to a stimulating discussion. We have three distinguished panelists. Let me introduce them to you. James Blight, Professor of International Relations and Director of the Vietnam Project at the Watson Institute for International Studies at Brown, and along with our own remarkable and respected colleague Dean Nye, founded and directed the Missile Crisis Project, first here and then at Brown, the author of 6 books. Robert Brigham, Associate Professor of History and Director of the Program in International Relations, Vassar College, an expert on both American and Vietnamese decision-making during the Vietnam War, well published on the war in both American and Vietnamese journals, and has published several books. And then Robert McNamara, a remarkable part of American history, Secretary of Defense for both President John Kennedy and President Lyndon Johnson, 1961 through 68, played a crucial role in all military operations from the Cuban Missile Crisis to the first movement toward peace in Vietnam. In 1995 wrote, in retrospect, The Tragedy and Lessons of Vietnam, which clearly describes the evolution of his views, always controversial and thriving on controversy, as I know this man, perhaps best summarized by John F. Kennedy Jr., and I quote, "Robert McNamara did what few have done. He took full responsibility for his decisions and admitted that he was wrong. Judging from the reception he got, I doubt many public servants will be brave enough to follow his example. I would like to thank him for teaching me something about bearing great adversity with great dignity." John F. Kennedy Jr. on Robert McNamara's In Retrospect. The format for the evening will be first Mr. Blight with 10 minutes. Bob. Bob McNamara, 10-minute introduction of Argument Without End and how that came to be. Then 10 minutes with Mr. James Blight discussing the unique use of the oral history in the book, and Robert Brigham, 10 minutes discussing new information that the book uncovered. Then I think at the end of that presentation we will go to questions and answers, and this program will have to end at 7:15. So with that, we will go forward. Robert McNamara, please.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Alan. Having appeared before our chairman several times in his capacity as one of the most outstanding senators, different in party from me, but certainly one of the most outstanding senators I've met in 40 years in Washington, I know he's a stickler for timing. And I wanted to modify slightly what he said. He had us 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes. But actually, I was supposed to come in with an ending 10 minutes, and I'm yielding that time to my 2 colleagues so that we can ensure that there's adequate time for questions.
This is very fair. I will abide by that.
Good. Well, I knew otherwise he'd cut them off or me off. Now, we're particularly interested in the questions. It's the most interesting part of the meeting to me. But let me begin by telling you a little bit about how this book, this happens to be a galley. I've had to use a galley. I didn't get my copy until last week, and I didn't have time to underline it the way I've underlined this. But in any event, this book I want to tell you how it came about and what its theme and structure is. In the preface of this book, In Retrospect, which I published 4 years ago, I said this is the book I never intended to write. And I finally decided to write in retrospect because I wanted to put before the American people why their government and its leaders behaved as that he did with respect to Vietnam. And I wanted to draw lessons from that behavior. And the last chapter in this book is labeled Lessons. But as I finished writing it, it was very clear to me, as far as drawing lessons was concerned, I was trying to clap with one hand. It was impossible for me to draw the proper lessons when I in particular, but others that I'd associate with, had had no contact with our opponents. And this book, therefore, is written from a very one-sided perspective, from the perspective of the presidents and the secretaries of state and defense of the United States. We had no contact with the Vietnamese. And by the way, I'm not going to comment on lessons now. We'll get into that. I know your questions are going to be related to Kosovo, lessons from Vietnam, applicable to Kosovo. But one of the major lessons is you've got to communicate with your enemy or your opponent or the other side. We had, in my 7 years as secretary, we didn't have 1 minute of communication between Presidents and Kennedy and Johnson on the one hand and Ho Chi Minh and Pham Van Dong, who was his prime minister, on the other. In any event, as I finished the book, it was clear to me that the lessons could be only preliminary at best. And I had learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis Critical Oral History Project, as Alan said, started by Joe Nye and by Jim, that I'd been a part of for 5 years, from 87 to 92. I'd learned how much one could learn from sitting down with one's opponents and exchanging judgments on what each had done and what the implications were for the future, and in particular for lessons. And there is, in this book, a reflection of some of the lessons we learned from those Cuban Missile hearings. They're frightening. They're lessons that relate to how to avoid nuclear war. We came that close to nuclear war in connection with the Cuban Missile Crisis. We didn't understand how close we came for 30 years. Now, that may sound totally unbelievable to you, but it is a fact. And there are some words in here in the first chapter that I think will convince you of that. In any event, as I finished, in retrospect, I concluded we just had to get in touch with the North Vietnamese to try to understand what they thought they were doing when we did what we did. And moreover, I had formed an hypothesis, which was that each of us, North Vietnam and the U.S., could have avoided the war entirely, or could have terminated it on any one of a number of occasions without any significant change in its ending geopolitical position. We had missed opportunities to do that. And to put this war in perspective, the Vietnamese, South and North, military and civilian, on the basis of Hanoi's figures, lost 3,800,000 killed. We lost 58,000 Americans killed. To put the 3,800,000 in perspective, on our population base, that's equivalent to 27 million American dead. It was one of the bloodiest wars in all of history, from their point of view. Now, why did it happen? When I say my hypothesis was that each of us could have avoided it or terminated it earlier without any significant change in our geopolitical position, what in God's name was I thinking about? I formulated a set of missed opportunities. I'm not going to take time now to go over them with you. They're discussed here fully. They're the theme. They're the theme of the book, and the analysis of those leads up to the last chapter, which is the lessons. So that's what I wanted to do. And I thought, how to do it? We didn't have diplomatic relations with Hanoi at the time. I wanted to ensure that we followed exactly the practice that Jim Blight and Joe Nye had, which was to bring together two groups on each side. Two groups in the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis on the U.S. side, and two groups on the side of the Cubans and the Soviets. And one of the groups consisted of policymakers, military leaders, and diplomatic leaders, political leaders of the time. And the other group consisted of scholars. And we had this diplomatic leaders, military leadership group, and scholarly group on each side. So that's what I wanted to do with respect to I call it North Vietnam today, Hanoi. And there are living today in Hanoi senior military leaders and senior diplomatic leaders who were carrying out the decisions during the Vietnam War in the 1960s. counterparts of myself and those policymakers, military leaders I brought with me. And there are very, very outstanding scholars on each side. Most outstanding Vietnamese scholar in the United States, I think, is this young man to my left. Bob Brigham speaks Vietnamese. He lived there for 2 years. He spent 35 years, the last 35 years of his life, studying that war. So I wanted to bring how to do it. I was almost certain if I contacted the Hanoi government directly, they'd say no. So I got in touch with Les Gelb, the director of the Council on Foreign Relations, who had worked with me in the Pentagon. As a matter of fact, he was the person whom I asked to put together the Pentagon Papers. Extraordinarily able person. He got in touch with, since they had no ambassador to the U.S., he got in touch with their ambassador to the United Nations, Mr. LeBang. LeBang said, my God, McNamara is asking us to admit error. He's saying that there were missed opportunities to prevent the war or stop it. And he said, my people aren't going to admit that. We're not prepared to admit error. You people made error. We didn't make errors. Well, I said, look, let's push them. So they went, LeBang went to Hanoi, and Hanoi said, I said, let's start with an exploratory mission, just 4 scholars. So they came back and said, we'll accept the exploratory mission, but under the understanding that McNamara will accompany it. So that was essentially the first of a series of meetings. We ended up with 6 meetings with the Vietnamese and 1 international meeting financed by the Rockefeller Foundation in Bellagio last July, which reviewed a manuscript of this book. 25 international experts in international relations, 2 Vietnamese, most of them from Western Europe, some from Russia and some from the US. And out of all that, we appraised the missed opportunities. I think we, the group that have been working on it, are in agreement. There were those missed opportunities. Each side now believes there's merit to my hypothesis. Each side now believes each of us could have avoided the war, or we could have terminated it earlier. There were the missed opportunities. Now, what were they? Why were they missed? What lessons can we draw? That's the theme, structure, purpose of the book. And before I stop, let me say to you, my earliest memory as a child, you may find this difficult to believe, but it's vivid in my mind. My earliest memory as a child is of a city exploding with joy. The city was San Francisco. I was born there. The date was November 11, 1918. That tells you a little bit about my age. But the date, of course, November 11, 1918, was Armistice Day. And the city was obviously celebrating the end of World War I. But many in the city were celebrating the strongly held belief of our president, Woodrow Wilson, that we had fought a war to end all wars. How wrong we were. In this century, the human race will have killed 160 million human beings by conflict within nations and by conflict across borders. So the question I put to you, and I put it to myself, and that's what the book includes, this quote I've just given you. The question I put to myself and I put to you is that what we want in the first century of the next millennium? I don't. I hope you don't. If we don't, how are we going to avoid it? The only way to avoid it is by examining how we got into the situations we were in the 20th century that led to killing 160 million humans. Now, the Vietnam War wasn't by any means the worst war, but it was a war, a significant war, a bloody war, and it was in many ways rather typical of potential conflicts that we will see in the 21st century. Hopefully we can avoid. The book was written in the press before Kosovo came up. The lessons were not designed to be applied to Kosovo. I suggest they do. We can talk more about that later. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Bob. Mr. Bryant, please. Blake.
I first heard about the Cuban Missile Crisis in that room right over there in a lecture by Graham Allison. And 10 years later, we were all still working on it together, including Graham. I have been to so many events in this room, but it's the first time I've ever been facing this direction, and I can tell you I can't see anything. I assume there are people out there. We had a big debate about who should go first, and when we introduced it at Brown on Friday, Bob McNamara got to go first because it was National Secretaries Week. Bob Brigham and I thought that didn't apply this week, but we learned a little something in the IOP living room, which is that it applies every day of every week. The British historian and philosopher R.G. Collingwood once wrote, "In history, as in all serious matters, no achievement is ever final. Every new generation must rewrite history in its own way. Every new historian, not content with giving new answers to old questions, must revise the questions themselves." It is ironical that the research team leading the way in reinvestigating the Vietnam War, parenthetically, the team, when I say team or we say team, we're talking about over 50 people, 30 of whom live in Vietnam, 20 scattered throughout the rest of the world, some in this country. But it is a major international effort to reinterpret this. But it's led by the person to my right, who at age 82 or nearly 83 is certainly not a member of the new generation, at least none that we know anything about. But it is, we believe, a work of serious history, and one, as far as we know, that's fundamentally different in many important respects from anything that's come before it. Why? Because we have asked questions seldom, if ever, asked in the West, because there was nobody to ask them of. We've asked them of knowledgeable Vietnamese scholars and former officials who have never before spoken for the public record, and because their answers over the last 4 years, that's 4 years next month, have been given within the context of an evolving U.S.-Vietnamese dialogue of increasing trust and openness. How did it happen? From my point of view, it began at 7 a.m. on a Saturday in February 1995 when Bob McNamara called just before his memoir, In Retrospect, was published. And he proposed out of the blue, before breakfast, before coffee, before anything, within 30 seconds, that we try to recapitulate, methodologically speaking, what we had done first in this institution and then at Brown after 1990 on the Cuban Missile Crisis, which revealed things that were not just surprising, but things that were never dreamed of, like the existence of 162 nuclear weapons on the North Shore of Cuba, like the authorization of the Soviet commander in Cuba to use them, like Fidel Castro's intense interest in their using them. And when we combine this with the nearness of the American invasion and air attack on the 26th, 27th, 28th of October, 1962, to say that we came close to a nuclear war is no longer hyperbole. It's a fact. That came out of these meetings. Many of those facts were first revealed in Havana, Cuba, in 1992. I told Bob that I'd try, but we were up against it. We had no funding, no contacts with the Vietnamese, no committed American participants, senior participants, other than Bob. There are two Bobs. There's Bob McNamara and Bob Brigham, and in the era of email and bad spelling and all that, this has gotten to be a real issue. So he has become, at the suggestion of one of our colleagues, Jim Hirschberg, he is Maximum Bob, named after the main character in an Elmore Leonard novel, a hanging judge in Florida who hangs everybody for everything. And he is Historical Bob. Although one person that we deal with at the publisher refers to Maximum Bob as Historic Bob, but it keeps moving along in this fashion. We had nothing that, in other words, that we needed in order to proceed except the feeling on my own part that, excuse me, to turn this down would be to turn my back on the most significant event of my generation. And I wasn't willing to do that. We were 90% of the way through a project on the decline of détente in the Carter-Brezhnev years, 4 or 5 conferences into it. And we put it on the shelf to see if we could make this work. There are 3 elements in what we do. There are documents. Documents are absolutely essential. Documents can be almost anything on paper. But we needed documents in order to provide a level playing field for people who had memories. Second element, people with memories, people who who had responsibility for the events in question. And we need scholars, people who devote their lives to the events in question, but who have no direct experience making the kinds of decisions that had to be made under great pressure with bad information or uncertain information. And so we began. We started by calling Bob Brigham, who helped us assemble a team of scholars, both in Vietnam and in the United States, and as Bob said, in Western Europe. The document base was gathered. Bob Brigham assembled a team of bilingual people at Vassar College, where he teaches, and translated and retranslated a notebook of 1,300 pages, which was sent in 20 copies to the Vietnamese 4 months before our first major agenda-setting meeting. I raise this not because I have stock in Hammermill Bond or anything like that, but because this is not typical oral history. People don't just tell stories. They tell it in a very rich context. They have to convince their former colleagues and their former adversaries and scholars that what they say is so. And the scholars have to convince the former officials that what they say is so. And when you get a group looking backward from the standpoint of people who made decisions as they were moving forward, trying to create an outcome, having that conversation with people who only know about the outcome and then work back from there, you have the ingredients we discovered in the Missile Crisis Project here in this institution between 87 and 90. You have the ingredients of something very new and explosive and unpredictable. And this brings me to my next point, which is the key difference between former officials and scholars, in my own personal point of view. We are the people who gather the goodies, the people who write the books, who depend on new information and its dispensation and its analysis for our careers and all of that sort of thing. The people we're asking to sit down at these tables across from each other, in this case, mutually share responsibility with their colleagues, but they share in the responsibility for the deaths of almost 4 million people. So you should expect difficulties when the meeting finally occurs. It took over 3 years to put them in the seats in Hanoi in June of 1997. And the first exchanges were brutal. They were more brutal than I anticipated. We came close on several occasions to walking out, to leaving the country and not coming back. We felt they were stonewalling. We knew that there were thought police at the table who were looking after people who seemed to want to talk. And it was just damn difficult. I'm sure they had some feelings about some of us, including Bob, who kept asking for them to come forward and answer the questions. Did you think this? Did you think that? And so forth. It was on the agenda. Why aren't we talking? And yet at the same time, on the coffee breaks, at lunches, and so forth, people would come up to us and say, some of us want to talk. Let's continue talking. Please don't get the wrong impression. This is a certain kind of society, but we have a story to tell, and we believe we know some of the answers to your questions. Let's not let this be the last meeting. And it wasn't. It was difficult, but there were many more meetings, and just to give you an example, whereas the first meeting started with accusations, canned speeches on the Vietnamese side, reading basically insulting remarks directed toward our former officials. A meeting held last February in Hanoi began with the senior person on the Vietnamese side making a gavel sound with his finger and saying, so what would you like to know? And for 4 days, we discussed in an atmosphere I can only describe as sort of surreal and scintillating. On tape, all of our conferences, they're all on audio tape, and they're all double translated by people from there and people from here. There's no guessing about what went on, and if people didn't mean to say exactly what's on the tape but really had something else to say, then put it in. That's all taken into account in the book. I mean to say that the people who were responsible for making those decisions evolved, including Bob. They evolved into a kind of group that wanted to solve a common problem, which was, why in the world did two countries that have no history, that have nothing really, no bone to pick or anything that one could imagine, would cause even a skirmish, could get involved in a war that almost utterly destroyed two countries, North and South Vietnam, and tore this country apart? How could it happen? There must be responsibility on both sides, because as Mr. Nguyen Co Tak, the person with his fist in Bob's face, this is not a doctored picture, this is as close as the fist was to Bob's face at the time over lunch on the first day of the conference. As he said in wonderful Charles Boyer English at one point, well, I guess it does take two to tango.
Up to then, the point is, up to then, he'd said, yes, there were missed opportunities. You missed them. We missed no opportunities. We made no mistakes. You made the mistakes. And that's when he's pounding there. 4 days later, he took me aside and said, Bob, you're right. We missed them. Millions of people were killed because we both missed opportunities. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Nguyen Co Tak died in April following the June conference. He was not well at the conference, but his greatest act in service of this process was not reading a speech that had been written for him by his fellow Politburo members on the last day after Bob made the concluding remarks. Tak put the speech back in his bag without ever reading it. We have since become aware of its contents, and it was a brutal anti-American diatribe worthy of Liberation Radio or worthy of Radio Hanoi back in the 1960s. Instead, he looked at Bob and he said, I think we should talk. And then he winked and said, I'm glad we didn't miss this opportunity, but we will have missed it if we don't carry this process forward. Now, what happened?
And then he died.
And then he...
Sadly.
A non-trivial thing in that when the major figure, as we learned, almost incredibly, inside the system was him to make this process work, but therefore in letting it go, the really hardliners made him do the policing. And one can only sort of imagine what was going on inside him.
Jim,
Now,
you've gone about 13, 14 minutes, and we do want to get to your colleague.
thank you, Alan. That's what he's for.
That's what
Joseph
we paid you for.
Lelyveld of the New York Times once wrote, when we talk about Vietnam, we are seldom talking about the country of that name or the situation of the people who live there. Usually we are talking about ourselves, and probably we always were. We hope, those of us who've been involved in this project, that this is the beginning of the end of the narcissistic obsession with what the war did to us and the beginning of mutual understanding. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim Blight, and now Robert Brigham.
As Bob McNamara said earlier, I've spent a good deal of my life studying the Vietnam War. I've tried to keep current on all of the recent scholarship. I think this book, Argument Without End, will revise substantially our understanding of the Vietnam War. Almost every page is rich in detail that adds to our historical understanding. The policymakers who came from both sides to sit down and talk in open and frank discussions gave us all the great gift. And we do hope that this history gives us a usable past, that we can look back at this conflict and draw lessons from it so that we can avoid similar mistakes in the future. I'm going to share with you this evening, however, just 2 or 3 historical revelations that came to us during the course of these deliberations. The first is on the character and nature of the National Liberation Front and its role in the development, possible development of a coalition government. The second is on the attack at Pleiku, which took place in February 1965 when communist forces attacked American Army barracks there. And the third is on a secret peace initiative that Mr. McNamara picked up off the Secretary of State's desk in the summer of 1967 and forwarded in the fall of 1967. For a long time, we've known quite a bit about the National Liberation Front. This was the southern branch of the party. This was the military and political arm of the Southern Revolution. During the Vietnam War itself, Dean Rusk said the NLF was nothing more than a puppet on a string. Key members of the Kennedy and Johnson administration believed that Hanoi had created the NLF with the sole purpose of taking the South by force. In contrast, in sharp contrast, many academics and anti-war activists said that the NLF was completely autonomous and independent of Hanoi, that it had risen from the tinder-dry paddy fields of South Vietnam in response to the corrupt and oppressive Ngo Dinh Diem regime. And those two views, those two polar opposites, gripped our imagination and our historical understanding throughout much of the conflict. It's only in post-war period that we began to see some gray area between those two extremes. Through our process of critical oral history, we now know that the NLF was neither a puppet of Hanoi nor autonomous and independent. That, in fact, it was a communist branch in the South, but it contained many non-communists. And many scholars have written that. That's not the revelation. What's important about our new understanding of the NLF is how much regionalism played a role in the party. The NLF was completely Southern. There were no Northerners in the National Liberation Front at all. But there were Southern non-communists and Southern communists. There was the facade of non-communists running the front, but in effect it was a communist arm. But they were Southerners first and foremost, and we found this out in our deliberations in Hanoi and in Bellagio. The Southerners, by and large, thought that they had been sold out by their Northern brothers at Geneva in 1954, and we're not going to let that happen again. And we saw repeatedly in our meetings examples of Southerners stepping forward and saying that there was a Southern worldview that differed very much from Hanoi. Now that's important to realize, too, that in Hanoi, a Southerner was the top policymaker, a man named Le Duan, who came to power as a Secretary General in 1960 and stayed in that position throughout the entire period of the American War. He was sympathetic to Southerners. He understood that they had a very different history than Northerners since 1954. And so he proposed a coalition government in early 1962 for Saigon. Kennedy administration did not take it seriously. It was based on the concept of neutralism, where you'd bring a variety of forces together to form a coalition government in Saigon. They didn't believe it could work because it had failed so miserably in Laos. Where Americans saw failure in Laos, however, Le Duan, the party Secretary General, saw success. And he wanted to replicate this failed experience in Laos and Saigon. They saw it very differently. They saw that they were restrained in Laos and that they had given in to many American demands during these negotiations. Regionalism within the Communist Party tells us that even if our worst predictions were true, even if Dean Rusk and Walt Rostow, who believed that any coalition government would just be handing Saigon and South Vietnam over to the communists, even if that was true, what you'd be doing is handing it over to Southern communists. And Northerners and Southerners alike within the party told us repeatedly that negotiations between those two factions to unify the country, even under the socialist banner, would take 10 to 15 years. Now, some people had written during the time that it would take a decade or so to work out all the details. But what they did not know was the strong sense of regionalism. Very few people have reported on regionalism in the party at all, and fewer still have reported on its relationship to a coalition government. If we knew then what we know now, that Southerners had a Southern worldview, that they had distinct aspirations and goals, we think now that there might have been some possibility in the Kennedy years to actually sit down and form a coalition government, understanding that, yes, it may, in fact, fall to a socialist regime shortly, but they were Southerners, and they had psychocultural distinctions from their brothers in the North and a very real different political history. So that is one of the revelations that comes very early in this book. Let me now move to Pleiku, which was an attack in February 1965 on an army barracks in the Central Highlands, killing 8 Americans and wounding over 100. This attack happened while George Bundy, National Security Advisor, was in Saigon, and Kosygin, the Soviet foreign minister, was in Hanoi. Because Bundy was in Saigon, he then went up to Pleiku to view the damage. He saw the wreckage of the barracks, he saw the destroyed helicopters, he saw the body bags. On his way back home from Vietnam to Washington, he sent a cable to Lyndon Johnson. It became one of the most influential cables of the war. It said, in effect, that the Vietnamese had purposefully tried to embarrass the United States, that this was a concerted effort at escalation, and that it must be met with deliberate speed and a firm response. That memo convinced many people in the Johnson administration to go ahead with what became known as Operation Rolling Thunder, the sustained bombing of the North. We now know from our meetings with the Vietnamese that this was not a concerted effort, concentrated effort by Hanoi, that it was not a central command decision to purposefully embarrass the United States by attacking an American Army barracks while McGeorge Bundy was in Saigon and Kasigan was in Hanoi. We now know that, in fact, it was Southern guerrillas, irregular guerrillas at that, who attacked the Army barracks, that they had no command control from Hanoi, that this was part of their regular People's War activity that had been going on since January 1961. They were surprised to find out that we were so interested in Pleiku. They said more Americans actually died 3 months before in the Brinks Hotel bombing in Saigon. Why do you keep bringing up Pleiku? We had to explain to them, Pleiku is the trigger of the Vietnam War. That memo and Operation Rolling Thunder paves the way for the introduction to ground troops. The first American ground troops go to Vietnam to protect American air bases that are flying flights out for Operation Rolling Thunder. It's only in July 1965 that ground troop mission changes fundamentally. So if you take away the trigger, you take away much of the cause in this particular, the causal relationship in this particular event. So it's local people, it's not coordinated by Hanoi. And then we found out, much to our surprise, that someone who is now a general in the Vietnamese army was near Pleiku at the time of the attack. And he said that these irregular guerrillas did not even know Americans were in these barracks. This was, after all, a time when American advisors were working very closely. There are no American ground troops, per se, in February 1965 in Vietnam. There's our advisors, and they're working very closely with the South Vietnamese army. The irregular guerrilla forces thought they were just attacking a South Vietnamese base that was in a key location near Route 9 in the Central Highlands, something that they had been doing for the last 4 years, did not know that Americans were billeted there as well. It was a long-distance mortar attack. They had no on-site reconnaissance or intelligence information at all. This kind of lack of central command and control also took place in Tonkin Gulf. We now know beyond a shadow of a doubt there was no second attack in August 1964, but more importantly, we now know that this was not, again, a provocative action by Hanoi, that it was a local initiative by a local commander who read the situation perhaps incorrectly in the Gulf waters. Let me quickly turn now to the last revelation I'd like to share with you this evening, and that is a secret peace initiative codenamed Pennsylvania. From 1965 to 1968, there were over 176 secret peace initiatives, excluding Averell Harriman's World Peace Tour. In these 176 initiatives, absolutely nothing bore fruit. None of these led to an end to the Vietnam War. And these were serious initiatives on both sides. But there were great problems. The Vietnamese never initiated any of these initiatives because they did not want to appear weak. And they continually told us, you don't understand what it's like to be a small country in a war with the world's superpower. You cannot initiate any action for the perception of being weak, and your stronger adversary will then go for the kill. So they were very conscious of this all the time. This Pennsylvania initiative had sat in the State Department for a while and languishing. It was just like all the other secret peace initiatives until Bob McNamara picked it up. He elicited Henry Kissinger's help. Kissinger gave a message to 2 French scientists, one of whom had a personal connection with Ho Chi Minh. They had gone to Hanoi, they had delivered the message, and had come home. The message was, to the Vietnamese, fundamentally different than any other secret peace initiative they had heard. They had been charting these very carefully over those 3 years, and they saw a great movement in Pennsylvania. So much so that their foreign ministry said in a Political Bureau meeting, we think we can work with this. We think we can get the Americans to a table and from this find peace. In fact, this Pennsylvania initiative did lay the groundwork for the eventual peace draft initialed in October 1972. Why didn't it stop the war in the fall of 1967? More Americans and Vietnamese were killed after the peace process started than before. Pennsylvania would have avoided much bloodshed. Why didn't it end the war then? Because on the Military Commission, which sits on the Political Bureau, they refused to let the Foreign Ministry follow this peace initiative through. They thought that the United States had lost, that the Vietnamese communists had lost ground in the Geneva negotiations, that they'd been sold down the river by their Soviet and Chinese allies, and they were never going to lose at the diplomatic table what they won on the battlefield again. So they were planning the Tet Offensive to win at the battlefield, and that's what they were going to do. So the Military Commission took the day, And this initiative died in Hanoi with diplomats willing to follow it through. And from that, we believe there possibly could have been an end to the war following the provisions laid out in this. Thank you very much.
Well, questions? Please. Questions? If you'll please give your name and class if you're a student, and if we could have questions in the form of questions, it would be highly desirable. Though the temptation to do otherwise will be great. Thank you. Please.
Hi, my name is Matt Coopersmith. I'm a freshman at the college. And my question has to do somewhat with the Cuban Missile Crisis, in that...
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
I'm sorry. Professor Blight mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis. And certainly one of the lessons that was learned at the time was that communication was indeed important. And certainly right afterwards, the hotline was installed between the White House and the Kremlin. And my question for Mr. McNamara is, why was this lesson that was certainly learned by policymakers that were left over from the Kennedy administration, why was this not applied at the time of the Vietnam War, but certainly now you realize it? Why was this lesson? Why do you not realize this lesson back in 1965, 66?
That's a very good question, and one of the lessons is just exactly what this gentleman pointed to. For God's sakes, communicate with your opponent. Now, it seems obvious to you today that we should have. I want to suggest to you we haven't been doing it very well today or yesterday. And we may not do it very well tomorrow. I hope I'll be proven wrong. But in any event, we didn't do it well during the Vietnam War, nor did we do it very well in connection with the Soviet Union, excepting in one or two periods of crisis. You're absolutely right about the hotline, which was installed after the Cuban Missile Crisis, as I recall it, in the early part of 1963. It was never used until June of 1967. And we'd gone through some major crises with the Soviet Union in the meantime. We did not communicate well with the Soviet Union during that period. And when it was used, by the way, in June of 67, there's a very amusing account of that in this book in the midst of the Middle East War. When it was used, one of the messages was, if you want war, you'll get war. Now that was communication, but it was a little late. And we hadn't been communicating well in the earlier period. We would have a total test ban today. I think my former associate right here would agree with that. If we'd communicated properly on the test ban back in 1961 and 62, we didn't communicate then. We have a history of not communicating with opponents. And I must say the opponents have a history of not communicating with us. But we should learn from that. We should take the initiative. We haven't. We'll talk more about it perhaps in relation to Kosovo.
This question, please.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Annika Culver. I'm at GSAS studying Regional Studies East Asia. I remember Robert McNamara and Robert Brigham at the same panel about 2 years ago when you were discussing your book this is McNamara. I'd like to ask you, Professor Brigham, actually I was a student of his at Vassar, who he very much influenced me to go and study foreign policy and history. But anyway, Bob, I was wondering about your efforts with student exchanges in Vietnam and getting American students and Vietnamese students to better understand the history and therefore laying the groundwork towards historical understanding and this issue of communication, improving communication between different countries and cultures.
Thanks for your question. It's nice to see you again. Every year I take a group of students to Vietnam and we meet with the host institutions of this project are the Watson Institute at Brown University and the Institute of International Relations in Hanoi. I take my Vassar students to Hanoi as much as I can, as often as I can, and we sit down and have a seminar with their students in international relations. We start it over the internet before we get there, and they choose the topic. It has to be something in foreign relations. So we have reached out that way. And each of our trips, we we involve as many research assistants on campus as we can. At Vassar, I have a team of about 5 to 10 people who work with me. I know the same is true at Brown. We take these people with us on the trips. They're invaluable to our research and to our efforts. And so in this way, I think we are trying to have the next generation be a little better at the communication. And they have developed long and important relationships, I think, with each other as a process.
Up here, please. Can you speak up a
Speak
bit,
louder,
please?
please.
Is this working? Yeah.
Yes. Mhm.
My name is Josh Lippert. I'm a second-year public policy student here at the Kennedy School. My question is for the panel, and I was wondering whether the panel believes that NATO can get Mr. Milosevic to capitulate through air power alone.
There's a question. Quick.
As I say, the lessons chapter was written before Kosovo, but in effect it says, it answers that question. I do not believe there is a high probability, I won't say there's no probability, but I don't believe there's a high probability that air power alone, external air power, can deal effectively and conclusively with civil war and or a failed state. And that's the situation we have faced in Bosnia and face today in Kosovo. It was the situation we faced in South Vietnam. I think it's highly questionable whether air power on the scale that we were delivering it in Vietnam, which far exceeded the scale delivered in Europe or Asia during World War II, and very far exceeded the scale in Kosovo today. I think the evidence that points to that being likely to break the will of the political leaders or the people is not present. And in this book, we analyze the air power operation. I say we do, a military expert does. And he concludes there was never a chance to win militarily with air and ground, but certainly not a chance to win with air power alone. Now, the conclusion from that is not necessarily that you shouldn't use air power, but that you need to accompany it with something else. In certain cases, perhaps ground forces, but certainly a negotiating track. If you're dealing with the kinds of problems we dealt with in Vietnam and we're dealing with today in Kosovo, and up until very recently, I think that negotiating track has been missing. It must involve, in the case of Kosovo, it must involve the Russians. And we have not had the Russians deeply involved in negotiations.
May I ask
With
Jim
Kosovo.
Blight, excuse me, Bob, and Bob Brigham to give a minute each to respond to that question, if you could.
We were told by many of our Vietnamese colleagues that one single factor was most important in uniting the northern and southern communists around a common cause, and that was the United States bombing of the North, which brought them into the war in a way that Southerners could understand because they had been at war, the Southern communists, since at least late 1955 when Diem returned. And I know that all of us, when we've been looking at these headlines over the last few weeks, those of us who are my age or older have had a slightly surreal feeling. But those of us who spent the last 4 years talking to the Vietnamese about the unifying effects of the greatest concentrated bombing campaign in history, I think for us it's been doubly surreal.
I'm in no way a policymaker. I'm a simple teacher and scholar, so I will tread lightly here. I think if we've learned anything from our historical studies of strategic air power, it's that they aren't very effective. World War II surveys showed us that, and certainly our experience in Vietnam shows us that. The amount of damage that we did in Vietnam actually, with our air power, increased their infiltration. Air power was designed to send a psychological message that there will be a tremendous cost to you to continue to wage war in the South. We often thought that they didn't get the message. We found out in Hanoi they got the message loud and clear, and here was their response. You're bombing us because you're losing in the South. We're going to send more men and supplies south. Unintended result.
Thank you very much. Please.
My name is Turgo Peterson. I'm a student here at mid-career. Mr. McNamara, you and your team, of course, deserve a lot of thanks from all of us, whereas perhaps some years ago you missed some opportunities. I think by not walking out at the meetings that you did have in Hanoi, you actually did seize the opportunity this time, and at least I would like to thank you for producing this book. However, when you were sitting in the White House, there was already material available from the war that you remember from your infancy. For instance, from Lloyd George saying, "We never thought that the First World War would have come." How was it possible for people in the beginning of the 1960s to say, well, we're going into this and it seems rational, when this information was more or less available? And how do we, many of us who are sitting here today, how do we prevent coming to the situation where we read your book, and I've read Lloyd George's book, and I'm thinking what's going on in Yugoslavia seems like exactly the sort of thing that should never have come. How do we prevent, when we're sitting in the moment, not seizing the opportunity? You've pointed out that it's there. How do we seize it?
Well, I think you read chapter 8, the lessons, and then try to apply it to today. In the Kosovo situation, I think one could predict ahead of time that air power wouldn't succeed by itself. I think one could predict ahead of time we needed more communication. I think one could predict ahead of time we needed more negotiating. That wasn't as clear in the early 60s. You've got to remember that from 1947, when George Kennan published that famous article under pseudonym in Foreign Affairs magazine, that we had been following a containment policy because we believed that the Soviets were determined to weaken the West. And every day from 1947, when I first read that article, to well into the latter part of the 1960s, I saw evidence that I believed showed that was the Soviet intention. In August of 1961, well, first in July of 1961, Kennedy had only been in office 6 months. He had a meeting with Khrushchev, the head of the Soviet Union in Vienna, in which it appeared to Kennedy as though Khrushchev were trying to beat him down and lay the groundwork for further pressure on Western Europe, extension of Soviet hegemony across Western Europe. The next month, the Soviet tried to take West Berlin, which had been in effect awarded to NATO under the treaty that ended World War II, tried to take it militarily. In October 62, they put 162 nuclear warheads in Cuba. And so it was every day. In June of 67, as I say, the hotline was used for the first time. One of the messages was, if you want war, you'll get war. Throughout this whole period, Khrushchev and Mao Zedong's rhetoric was sufficient to lead us to believe that we were fighting a continuing battle to preserve the security of the West. Now, I think we were wrong. I think we misunderstood the Soviets. I think we exaggerated both their intent and their capability. But if you'd lived through what we lived through every day, I think you'd understand why we made the error. It was a mistake, I think. It's not entirely clear, the history of that period, relation between the U.S. and Soviet Union, intentions, the Soviet government isn't yet fully recorded. But my belief is that we exaggerated the military effect, military intent and capability. But that was why we behaved as we did with respect to Vietnam. Eisenhower said in 1954, if South Vietnam falls, the dominoes will fall, meaning the rest of Asia's independent countries would fall. On January 19, 1961, his last day in office, he said to Kennedy and me and Dean Rusk and Doug Dillon, the Secretary of the Treasury, that if it's necessary to preserve the independence of Laos and South Vietnam, to keep them from under control of the Chinese and the Soviets, I, Eisenhower, believe we should fight unilaterally to achieve that end. And that was the atmosphere we lived in. I think we were wrong.
Question, please.
Ron Cooper, Harvard parent. First of all, gratified to be here. I was wondering, Mr. McNamara, whether there was one particular event or thought process that caused you in your 60s or 70s, as the case may be, to have gone ahead and started on this incredible project, and that you seem to have brought to at least some.
No, there wasn't one particular event. There was one period of 13 years when I was president of the World Bank. I went from the Secretary of Defense immediately to president of the World Bank, and as president of the World Bank for 13 years, I was prohibited by my contract and by accepted international procedure. I was prohibited from writing upon or commenting upon national affairs. So for that 13 years, I didn't think about it or work on it at all. And then, and that took me up to 1981. And then I didn't see Vietnam clearly for some time. And I didn't think I could write. There's no use writing a book like this unless you can draw conclusions and point to lessons. And quite frankly, it may be hard for you to believe this, but I didn't feel I could point to lessons for many years. And one Saturday, it would have been such as, I don't know, 1981, 82. I was in my office, and I just took a pad of paper. I don't use any electronic gadgets, and I just wrote in pen and ink, I wrote the lessons that I thought one could derive from our experience in Vietnam. And that's what led to the book.
Jim or Bob, at any point, add a postscript, please.
Obviously, the question's for Bob, and he's given you his answer. But I know, I think the experience here, beginning in this building with the Missile Crisis Project, showed a skeptic like Bob McNamara, who is very suspicious of his own memories, of the accuracy of his own memories in a way that actually all people are not. It showed him that it is really possible by assembling documents, former colleagues who disagreed with you at the time, former adversaries you may have never met, to somehow bring together a mix, and out of it comes a much truer picture of what really was going on at the time. And I'm sure that because one followed the other in sequence, that really the Vietnam War project that's been assembled here really was not possible without in a sense, the basic training of the missile crisis.
We're sitting here and we're 50 or 55, and Mr. McNamara made this change at a point where, and you look great, you're obviously bright as hell, but he made this change at a point where you would think he would have been entrenched in I think in a different thought process. So, my hat's off to you.
Thank you. And this microphone, please.
Yes. My name is Dan Blumenthal, and I'm a freshman at Harvard College. My question is for Mr. McNamara, and I was wondering if he could comment briefly on your thought process in 1966 and 67 in deciding to leave your post of Secretary of Defense and to go to the World Bank.
Well, to tell you the truth, I don't know whether I quit or was fired. Now, I have a very close friend who says, McNamara, you're crazy as hell. Of course you were fired. And in this book, there's a page of two pictures. And on the top picture, the president, Johnson, is leaning on his hands like this, and I'm in the picture. And the bottom picture, I'm leaning on my hand like this, and despondent. And under one picture, it says, I couldn't persuade him, and the other picture says, he couldn't persuade me. Now, that may sound humorous to you. It isn't. I had a deep affection for that man. I respected him. Of course he had his weaknesses. We all have our weaknesses. But he did a tremendous amount for this country. He dedicated his adult life to serving it. And I knew that when we came to loggerheads, we were each trying to act in ways that we thought were responsible to our people and to the country. And yet we were totally at loggerheads. Something had to give. And I left. Now, as I say, one of my closest friends said you were fired. I don't think it's quite as simple as that, but that's what happened.
This question, please.
My name is Anish Raman. I'm a sophomore at the college. Mr. McNamara, you made a number of critical decisions as secretary, and your book talks about lessons learned. Knowing now what you did not know then, what decision do you most regret?
Well, I was speaking earlier to a group of your faculty members and postdoctoral students and so on. And there are many decisions with respect to Vietnam I regret, but one of the critical ones, I think, occurred in January of 1965. At that time, McGeorge Bundy, the former dean at Harvard, the then national security advisor, an extremely able man, and I concluded that the course our nation was on, the military course, basically providing advisors to the South Vietnamese to help them train themselves and equip themselves to fight their war, would not work, and that the Viet Cong, the South Vietnamese communists, and the North Vietnamese would ultimately overpower the South Vietnamese, and Vietnam would be lost to communist control. So we wrote a very brief but very direct memorandum to Johnson, page and a half. And we said, Mr. President, the course we're on won't work. We cannot achieve our political objective that way, avoiding the loss of South Vietnam to the communists, avoiding the falling of the dominoes, avoiding the insecurity that would result from that to the West. We've got to change course. We either have to put in more or put in less and begin to withdraw. We don't know exactly which we should do. Each should be debated. We rather lean toward putting in more, but we're not certain it should be debated. What I regret is it was never debated. We never, at that time or later, ever thoughtfully reviewed, I'll call it withdrawing. That, I think, was one of our greatest errors.
Question here, please.
Hi, Robert Brigham said that the attack on Pleiku, when McGeorge Bundy reported it, it ended up being a different analysis, it occurred differently than his analysis. And my question is about the fallibility of American diplomatic and military policy makers, and especially the perception of that fallibility. And I'd just like to ask the panel to comment on how has the fallibility, and more importantly, the perception of fallibility of American policymakers changed as a result of the Vietnam War, and also since then to today, both in the mind of the American public and in the minds of the policymakers themselves. And how does whether or not these policymakers and the public think that they might be fallible or not affect the decisions that they're making?
I'm going to let Bob Brigham answer that, but let me just draw your attention to this point. The attack on Pleiku was, in a sense, the reason we didn't debate the two alternatives in the January 65 memorandum. The attack on Pleiku came in February. It was just at the time we should have been debating it. Our attention was diverted. Bob, answer the question.
Please. The whole panel, I'd like a response from each of you.
I think, as a historian of American foreign relations, one of the aspects of our policymaking that you do see over and over is human error. What's amazing to me, and what some of the lessons point to in this book, is that we do very little to build in that realization into a system. That there's not, for instance, I know Bob will talk about this later perhaps at greater length, that there is not a war cabinet established during the Vietnam War where people devote all of their time and energy just to trying to solve this problem. That there are not high contacts at the highest level of government. Doesn't recognize, in my view, enough of the real nature of human mistakes. It also leads me personally to work very strongly toward the elimination of nuclear weapons for that reason.
Jim?
Sure.
I think the question can be twisted around a little bit and made maybe just a little bit more perplexing, because, of course, the same group of men who really made the critical decisions in the Cuban Missile Crisis are, with the crucial exception of the change in presidents, essentially the same group of people who, in a sense, as Bob has said, did not make the decisions that he now, as he looks back, imagines that they might have made with that kind of information. Why? Why is this? Well, there's a lot of different reasons, and the president, of course, is very important and is central. However, we began talking somewhere in this process about something called a crisis in slow motion, which is what the Vietnam War was before it became the Vietnam War. In addition, there's plenty of evidence that some of the American, Bob is not one of them, but there's some of them who were academics who came from maybe this part of the world, actually had read people like Bernard Fall, the great French journalist and scholar. But you know the feeling, and you know what happened to the French, but the feeling was, but we're not the French. We're not going to make those mistakes. This is a kind of way for some of us anyway to operationalize and to get really specific about what people may talk about as arrogance. But it is just very difficult in the context that he's described of a threat of a global nature to pay attention to these little tiny countries. But in effect, by the time they paid attention to it, of course, it was really too late to prevent the tragedy.
Well, I mentioned earlier to one of your senior people here today that I hope the Kennedy School would address that question. I don't believe that today our government is organized to deal with crises in slow motion. I think we've been making mistakes with respect to Kosovo or more broadly Yugoslavia over a period of at least 6 years. It's been a crisis in slow motion. And I want to suggest to you that you can't name me the person who's been in charge full-time, 100% of his time, high-level person reporting to the president of the Yugoslav crisis in slow motion over the past 6 years. There hasn't been any single person in charge. The responsibility has been divided among many, many elements of the government. And that's the way we're organized. Now, there's some reason for that. But when you're dealing with potential war, I think you've got to organize differently. A friend of mine took a copy of this book to India, gave it to a senior member of the Indian government, and that person didn't give a damn about Vietnam. India wasn't interested in it, particularly not when this book came out. The person bought 10 copies and delivered it to senior members of the Indian government. He said, look, I'm not interested in Vietnam. This book is a case study on administration of government, or how not to administer a government. And we want to learn from it. And it is. Now, the problem is clear. The action you should take is not that easy to take, but it's about time we as a government addressed it. One of the things we don't address and haven't satisfactorily handled is institutional memory. You will not believe this, but when I became secretary, taking over from a very able man, Tom Gates, who was a friend of mine who had served as a director in the same corporation, I didn't receive one single piece of paper with words on it that he had read. Not one. Yet we were, in a sense, in the midst of the Vietnam War. We had engaged in this very, very dangerous relationship with the Soviet Union. We had a host of security problems across the world. We don't have an institutional memory. It's not systematic. We've got to develop it. It's just one of the many, many actions we should take. I think all of you should think about it, and the school should think about it.
There are two people on their feet. I'm going to take very swiftly those two questions here, and then we'll conclude.
You had the opportunity to meet with the North Vietnamese in a conference a couple of years ago to discuss your common findings. One of the things that Dean Rusk, for instance, and other U.S. policymakers claimed was that the anti-war movement was giving solace to the other side. And I'm curious whether you found out from the North Vietnamese whether, A, they were even aware of what was going on in this country. Did they know about the protest movement? Did they know about public opinion? Did this have any influence on them, or would it have made absolutely no difference? Did you get a chance to get an insight into how they saw the world? I've heard, for instance, on the one hand, that they couldn't afford the daily newspapers, so that they got their information from Time magazine. What did you find out about their knowledge, what was going on in this country?
Please.
This is something
Bob?
I've looked at over a number of years. And the answer is a little surprising. They understood that they were probably benefiting at some level from the anti-war movement. There was no coordinated attempt to put people in the streets in the United States. There were meetings with anti-war leaders, both in Hanoi and in Europe on several occasions, and those were solidarity gatherings, if you will. But what's interesting to me in the Vietnamese Communist documents, you see repeatedly high-ranking officials saying, don't really put too much credence in the American anti-war movement, especially the students. It's bourgeoisie, they're going to go back when their draft number passes them by. These kind of statements. It's doctrinaire things, the kind of stuff you find regularly in their documents. But the idea that the American peace movement was going to win the war was something they were very sensitive about. They were going to win the war. And you see that
You have a
repeatedly
quick
in the
comment.
documents.
Oh, excuse me.
One of the
Mr.
more
Brigham.
surprising things we heard came from a person that a scholar we've grown to respect very much, who worked in the foreign ministry at the time. He said, we tried to figure out what was going on, and we really didn't understand it at all. But now, after meeting with you people, I see that we were paying attention to the wrong peace movement. It was the peace movement inside the government that we knew nothing about, that we dearly wish we would have known something about.
Yes, final question, please.
For Secretary McNamara and for the panel, what lessons have you learned in your project and in your career that can be applied now to keep Yugoslavia, Kosovo, from becoming another Vietnam?
Well, they should have been applied yesterday. That's the first point. I do not think we've dealt properly with Yugoslavia over the last 6 years, at least. And when I say we, I don't mean the U.S. I mean we, Western Europe, we, NATO, we, Russia, we the U.S. And I think one could have learned from Vietnam how to be much, much more effective than we have over the past 6 years. I think there's much we could learn from Vietnam that we can apply today and tomorrow, particularly this emphasis on negotiation, particularly this absolute imperative requirement to bring the Russians more fully into relationship between us, NATO, and Milosevic.
Mr. Blight or Mr. Brigham, do you have any further?
There's an interesting disanalogy that I think it probably would be helpful to keep in mind. We've concluded, based on these conversations, that there was absolutely no chance of peace in Vietnam if the United States brought the Russians in. The United States tried this time and time again because they were used to dealing with the Russians, and they felt that the Russians had some control over the situation, and they did not. I think in this situation, it seems anyway, that any solution must have the Russians centrally involved, which is the inverse of the situation in the 1960s.
The strongest analogy I can think of is a desperate need to have high-level talks by all participants in a final peace.
Well, let me say this has been thank you very much for an energetic and profoundly fascinating evening of discussion of really one of the most gut-wrenching conflicts in our history. And thank you for being here and adding more knowledge to our knowledge of the argument without end. And that is indeed. And so thank you again. And let me remind all undergraduates are welcome to attend a post-forum discussion of the ideas presented here tonight in the first floor conference room, which is right there. Refreshments will be served. Pizza, probably. And let me say that with regard to sitting down with one's opponents, Robert, you've got to pay attention here. I paid attention. With regard to sitting down with one's opponents, that's where I'm going now to have dinner with Nina Totenberg. So it's a very good policy. And she was in my class today so that they can see both sides, and you have brought that to America in a most amazing way, and you're a gutsy guy. Thank you.
Give Nina